I am an old man now, just days shy of my 98th birthday, and for the better part of a century I have carried a heavy secret in my heart. Each evening I sit in my frayed armchair by the window, watching the sun melt into the horizon as motes of dust dance in the golden light. On the small side table beside me rests a rusted tin box filled with memories, a black and white photograph of my platoon in happier times, a tarnished Purple Heart medal, and a yellowed envelope addressed in a familiar hand. My fingers tremble as I trace the cursive letters of the name on that envelope, and my eyes sting with tears that have been a lifetime in coming. For over 70 years, I have thought about burning this letter or burying it deep, or even opening it to finally read the words inside and free my soul. But I never had the courage. The things we carry home from war are not just medals and scars. They are also ghosts of choices we didn't make, of words left unsaid. In my case, it's one unsent letter and the story behind it. I have never told this story to a living soul, not to my late wife, who sometimes found me bolting upright from nightmares, not to my son, who once discovered me weeping over that tin box, not even to the quiet conscience I tried to numb with time. Tonight, however, the silence must be broken. The weight of this secret has bowed my shoulders and etched lines deep into my brow. I can feel the end of my road drawing near. My doctor doesn't say it outright, but I know. Perhaps that's why the ghosts of my past have grown restless, why I feel Henry's presence in every sunset. If I don't speak now, the truth will die with me, and some truths demand to be heard, even if it takes a lifetime. So here I am, speaking aloud to the emptiness of my living room, to the dust motes swirling in the last light of day, my voice cracking from disuse and emotion as I finally begin. This is the story I've kept locked within me since the war, the story of how I failed my dearest friend, and how I've carried his final wish folded in my pocket all these years without fulfilling it. It's time to face the past. It's time to ask forgiveness from him and from myself. I close my eyes and let the years peel away in my mind. Suddenly, I am 19 again, a fresh-faced private standing on a bustling train platform in 1943, with a duffel bag at my feet and fear hidden beneath my eager grin. That was the day I met Henry Morrison. Henry was a tall, lanky farm boy from Kansas who had never seen the ocean until the Army shipped us off to basic training. I was a street-smart kid from Brooklyn who thought I'd seen it all. We made an unlikely pair from the start. He teased my fast-talking city slang. I ribbed him about his slow country drawl and how he said y'all even to the officers. Yet, in those few short weeks of training, we became as close as brothers, drawn together by youthful bravado and the unspoken truth that we were both terrified of what lay ahead. By the time we shipped out to Europe, the war was in full fury. Together, Henry and I slogged through mud and snow, fought shoulder to shoulder through the hedgerows of France and the bitter cold of the Ardennes. I can still recall the crunch of frozen ground under our boots during the Battle of the Bulge and the distant thunder of artillery that shook the night. Through it all, Henry kept a hopeful flame alive in the darkness by speaking of home. On frigid nights in a foxhole under skies lit by tracer fire, I'd hear him whisper a trembling prayer, "Just get me home to my Martha and our baby on the way." He would murmur his unborn child's name to himself when he thought no one was listening. Charles, if it was a boy, after his own father. Grace, if a girl. Those small dreams of the future kept him going through the horrors around us. They gave him a beacon of hope. In truth, they gave me hope too, even though I had no sweetheart waiting, only my aging parents back in New York. War, however, has a cruel way of shattering even the most fervent prayers. In March 1945, as the conflict neared its end, our unit was ordered to push into a small German village on the east bank of the Rhine. Rumor had it the enemy was on its last legs, perhaps close to surrender. That foggy morning, we moved cautiously through silent, deserted streets with rifles clutched tight to our chests. I remember the smell of wet earth and lingering smoke, and the way my heart thudded like a hammer in my ears. Henry was a step behind me, close enough that I could hear him quietly humming a shaky tune under his breath to steady his nerves. Suddenly, a rifle shot cracked through the air and chaos erupted. A sniper, hidden high in a church bell tower, opened fire. We scattered for cover behind stone walls and abandoned carts as muzzle flashes lit up the dim street. Adrenaline flooded my veins. Pressing my back against a cold brick wall, I glanced over to see Henry ducking down behind a wooden rain barrel across the street. Our eyes met for one tense second. I saw my own fear reflected in his face. I signaled frantically for him to stay down. My mind raced. We had to find that sniper. I was one of the better marksmen in our platoon, so I steadied my hands, took a breath, and raised my rifle, scanning the church tower. I caught a flicker of movement behind the slatted steeple shutters and began to squeeze the trigger. A gunshot rang out, but it wasn't mine. I saw Henry jerk violently and collapse beside the barrel, his rifle clattering onto the cobblestones. "Henry!" I screamed, the sound ripping from my throat before I even realized it. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as I broke cover and sprinted toward him, bullets whizzing past my ears. By some miracle, I slid to the ground at his side unharmed. Henry was sprawled on his back, a dark red stain blooming on the front of his dusty field jacket just below the collarbone. "No, no, no," I gasped, pressing my hands over the wound as if I could somehow keep his life from leaking out. His face had gone ashen. His lips trembled as he struggled to breathe, each intake a wet, shallow rattle. Those pale blue eyes of his, eyes that usually shone with quiet humor, were wide with terror now. He was going into shock. "It's okay, Henry. You're going to be okay. You hear me? Stay with me," I lied. Desperately, choking on every word. Behind me, I vaguely heard another crack of a rifle, one of our guys returning fire at the sniper. But all my attention was on my friend. Henry's shaking hand gripped my arm with surprising strength. His other hand fumbled weakly at his chest, and I realized he was trying to reach inside his jacket pocket. Understanding dawned, and I tore open his jacket, searching. My fingers closed on a folded, blood-speckled envelope tucked there. Henry coughed, a horrible wet sound, and managed to whisper above the din.
Letter for Martha."
His voice was barely more than a breath.
"Please, give it to her. To tell her I love."
The rest of his words dissolved into a gurgle of blood. "I will, Henry. I promise. I promise you," I spluttered, my vision blurred with tears as I cradled his head in my lap. "Just hang on, you're going to be fine," I pleaded, even as I felt his blood warm on my hands. He gave a tiny nod. Maybe he heard me. Maybe it was just reflex. But I saw a flicker of peace in his eyes for an instant. In the distance, Gunfire echoed and someone shouted that the sniper was down, but it all felt muted, unreal. All I could focus on was Henry. I could literally feel the life slipping out of him, as impossible to hold on to as water cupped in my hands. Henry's hand on my arm went slack. He opened his mouth as if to speak again, but only a soft exhale escaped. Then his body went still. Henry Morrison, my best friend in the world, died there in my arms on the cold cobblestones of some nameless German village as a pale and heartless dawn broke over the rooftops. I don't remember much of what happened immediately after. I know I was shaking him and screaming his name, refusing to believe he was gone, until medics pulled me away. They had to pry that bloodied letter from my grasp. I had been clutching it so tightly it left an imprint on my fingers. Something inside me cracked irreparably that day. War had already stolen so much from us by then, our innocence, our friends, our youthful laughter. But with Henry's last breath, it also stole any remaining faith or light I had left. The world went strangely silent for me, even as battle still raged around. Somehow, I stumbled through the firefight and the days that followed in a numb haze. I survived the war's final months on sheer empty inertia, but truth be told, a part of me never left that village square where Henry fell. When victory in Europe was declared and I finally shipped back home, I carried Henry's unopened letter pressed against my heart like a second heartbeat. The war was officially over for everyone else, but it did not end for me, not with that unfinished duty hanging over my soul. As the troop ship cut across the Atlantic and the Statue of Liberty came into hazy view, I felt only a hollow ache. I had survived when so many good men had not, and inside my jacket I held the last words of a dead man, a message I had sworn to deliver. A few months after VE Day, in the late summer of 1945, I found myself on a rutted dirt road in Kansas, standing at the fence line of the Morrison family farm. The late afternoon sun was sinking low, casting long shadows of oak trees across the yard. My heart thundered in my chest as I realized I was only 100 feet away from Henry's Martha and the child he would never meet. On the small porch of the farmhouse, I saw a young woman in a faded yellow summer dress holding a tiny bundle in her arms. Even from a distance I could tell she was gently rocking the infant and quietly sobbing. That sight nearly undid me. Martha looked so small and fragile in that moment, a new mother, barely out of girlhood herself, widowed by a war and ocean away. The baby in her arms couldn't have been more than a few months old. I later learned she'd had a boy and named him Charles, after Henry's father. Watching Martha cradle little Charles on that porch, her shoulders shaking with tears in the golden dusk, I felt my throat close up and my own eyes fill. I wanted more than anything to open the gate, walk up those steps, and place Henry's letter into her hands. The letter I had safeguarded with my very life. I wanted to tell her how bravely Henry had fought, how his final thoughts were of her and their baby, how he loved them more than anything in this world. I must have gone over those words 1,000 times in my head as I stood there at the fence, my feet feeling as heavy as lead. But every time I even thought about moving, a swell of shame and fear pinned me in place. How could I ever face her? How could I tell Martha that I had lived and Henry hadn't? Some irrational part of me felt I had failed him, that because I made it home and he did not, I had no right to deliver his final words. In the darkest corner of my heart, I even blamed myself for for his death. The sniper's bullet may have struck Henry, but I had hesitated before taking my shot. I became convinced in my grief that my moment of hesitation had cost him his life. Twisted by guilt, I started to believe I had broken my promise to keep him safe. In those days, that self-inflicted blame was easier to carry than accepting the cruel randomness of fate. I don't know how long I stood there, trembling by that fence, watching Martha weep into the twilight as little Charles fussed softly in her arms. Eventually, another figure, a neighbor, or perhaps her sister, came out onto the porch and gently guided Martha and the baby back inside. The sun had dipped below the horizon by then, and fireflies were beginning to flicker over the fields as the blue of evening set in. Still, I remained rooted in place, the unread letter burning a hole in my pocket. In the end, I turned away. I never opened that gate. I never knocked on the door. I told myself that maybe I could just mail the letter with a note explaining everything, that it would be kinder than appearing on her doorstep out of the blue. But I never found the courage to even do that. Instead, I fled, coward that I was, back to my own family in New York, carrying with me a letter that was not mine to keep. Back home in New York, life moved on in fits and starts. I eventually married a few years later, found a job as a mechanic, and raised a son. I did my best to bury the war and its ghosts in the deepest pit of my mind. To the outside world, I looked like just another returning veteran trying to be a good husband and father, and for a while, I suppose I was. But Henry's letter never left my side. It stayed hidden away in that old tin box along with my medals and dog tags. Every so often, late at night when my wife was asleep, I'd quietly take the envelope out and hold it under the lamp, my hands reverent and hesitant. I never opened it, of course. It wasn't mine to read. But simply feeling the weight of it, knowing what it represented, was enough to tighten a fist of guilt around my heart. Each time I pictured Martha back in Kansas and little Charlie growing up without his father, my chest would ache with a mix of sorrow, guilt, and shame. And so I let the years slip by, one after another, always finding some excuse to postpone my duty. They've moved on, I would tell myself. Showing up now would only reopen old wounds. Or, it's too late now. What difference would it make? The truth was, I was afraid. I had stared death in the face on the battlefield and marched through hell, but I could not summon the courage to face the widow of my best friend and deliver his final message. In the one way that truly mattered, I had been a coward. That realization haunted me more cruelly than any nightmare of bullets or blood. The decades rolled on. My hair turned from brown to silver to white. My son grew up and had children of his own, making me Grandpa Joe to two bright-eyed little ones who could never imagine the things their grandpa had seen in the war. Outwardly, I was the picture of a content retiree. I'd spend my days tinkering in the garage or telling harmless war anecdotes about muddy boots and cold coffee at the local VFW hall. But I never spoke a word about Henry or the letter that remained locked away in that box. After my wife passed on and the house fell quiet, all those memories and regrets I'd tried to bury began to resurface with a vengeance. I would bolt awake at 2 a.m. in a cold sweat, convinced I had just heard Henry's voice calling my name. In those nightmares, I was back in that German village watching him fall over and over. Sometimes I dreamed of Henry standing at the foot of my bed. No blood, no wounds, just as I remembered him, young and whole. He would look at me with a heartbreaking gaze of disappointment. He never spoke in these dreams, but I always understood the question in his eyes. Why didn't you give her my letter? On those nights, shaken and heartsick, I would shuffle out of bed and into the living room. There, with only the dim glow of a lamp, I'd open the tin box and gently lift out the yellowed envelope. "My dearest Martha," it said on the front in Henry's strong, neat handwriting. I'd run my thumb over those words, imagining what he must have poured into that letter, perhaps loving words of comfort for her, descriptions of mundane camp life meant to make her smile, or tender lines for the baby he never got to meet. I never once broke the seal to read it. That letter was Henry's last conversation with his wife, not mine. But the weight of those unknown words pressed heavily on me. Sometimes I wondered if, by selfishly holding on to it, I had prevented Henry's family from finding closure. Maybe Martha had eventually found some peace in not knowing what his final thoughts were. Would my showing up decades later only tear open old grief? Those doubts became my constant justification for inaction. They were the shield I hid behind to avoid doing what I had promised, and year after year I continued to hide. Even as my own life crept toward its final years, I still could not break my silence. It took a brush with death of my own to finally shake me awake. Last spring, in my 97th year, I had a small heart attack. It landed me in a hospital bed for a week. As I lay in that sterile room with tubes in my arms, the reality hit me. I could slip away from this world at any moment, and Henry's letter would die with me, his last wish forever unfulfilled. That thought terrified me far more than dying ever could. The very first night after I returned home from the hospital, I hobbled straight to my cabinet and pulled out the tin box. With trembling hands, I took Henry's letter and pressed it to my heart. And I finally cried. I cried like I hadn't cried since I was a 19-year-old boy, letting decades of grief and guilt pour out of me in heaving sobs. Through my tears, I begged aloud into the empty house for Henry's forgiveness and Martha's, and maybe even God's. When the storm of emotion finally ebbed, I knew what I had to do. Fear or no fear, shame or no shame, I had to try to make it right, no matter that it was almost 80 years too late. It still took me a few more months to gather the courage and strength for what I needed to do. The gentle insistence of my grandson finally pushed me over the last hurdle. When I confided in him the story of Henry's letter, something I had never even told my own son, his eyes welled with tears. He squeezed my hand and said,
"Grandpa, it's never too late to do the right thing."
Over the summer, with his help, I began searching for Henry's family. We discovered that Martha had passed away about a decade earlier, but her and Henry's son, Charles, was very much alive, a grandfather himself now, and still living not far from that old Kansas farm. My heart pounded when I dialed the phone number we found for him. A man answered, and as soon as I introduced myself as Joseph, Henry's friend from the war, his voice caught in his throat. He knew my name immediately. He said he'd grown up hearing stories about Dad's buddy Joe his whole life. I could barely speak, overcome with a mix of relief and nervousness, but Charles kindly invited me to visit. I don't think he fully knew why I was reaching out after so long, but he seemed genuinely happy just to hear from me. Despite my age and frailty, I was determined to make that journey. On a crisp autumn morning not long ago, my grandson and I traveled to Kansas. As our rental car turned down a familiar gravel lane and came to a stop in front of a modest farmhouse, I felt my heart slam against my ribs just as it had on that day in 1945. I stepped out of the car on unsteady legs, the chill of October air filling my lungs. Waiting on the porch was an elderly man with a warm, expectant expression. It was Charles. For a long moment, we just looked at each other across the distance. Two old men connected by the sacrifice of a young soldier so many years ago, neither quite able to believe this moment was real. Charles was the first to break the spell. He descended the porch steps slowly, and I shuffled forward to meet him halfway. My throat tightened as I fumbled to find the right words.
I'm Joe Dawson.
I managed hoarsely.
I was with your father when he.
Before I could finish, Charles closed the remaining distance between us and gently pulled me into an embrace.
Thank you for coming.
He whispered, his voice quavered with emotion. In that simple hug, I felt a warmth bloom in my chest, and for the first time in ages, the icy weight of guilt began to thaw. It was as if Henry himself was standing there with us, quietly bridging the gap of decades and drawing his family and his old friend together. We went inside and settled at the kitchen table. The walls were adorned with photographs, Charles's own children and grandchildren, and a faded sepia portrait on the mantel of a young Henry in uniform. My hands wouldn't stop trembling as I reached into my coat pocket and drew out the yellowed envelope. I laid it carefully on the table between us.
I've kept this for a very long time,
I said, my voice shaking.
It's a letter your father wrote to your mother. I'm so sorry I didn't bring it sooner.
My eyes blurred with tears as I finally pushed the letter toward him.
I promised him I would deliver it, but I never did.
I added in a broken apology. Charles's eyes brimmed over as well. He stared at the envelope like it was a sacred object. After a heavy pause, he picked it up with both hands as if handling something holy.
Thank you, Joe.
He choked out softly.
This means more than I can say.
He ran a finger gingerly over his mother's name on the envelope. The paper was fragile after so many decades. Charles drew a shaky breath, then looked at me with a trembling smile.
Would you read it with me?
He asked.
I think I'd like to hear it in your voice.
I swallowed hard. My mouth had gone dry, and I wasn't sure my voice would cooperate, but I nodded. I carefully broke the seal on Henry's letter, the brittle paper crackling in my hands. Unfolding the pages, I took a moment to steady myself. Then I began to read Henry's final words aloud, my voice barely above a whisper at first.
My dearest Martha,
I read gently.
I hope this letter finds you safe and well. I'm somewhere in Germany right now, and by the time you read this, I pray the war will be over and I'll be on my way home to you. There isn't a day I don't think about you and our little one. How I wish more than anything I could be there to see our baby's first smile, to hold you in my arms and never let go. I carry your last letter with me in my breast pocket, and I read it every night before I sleep. It still smells like home. Sometimes I swear I can even catch a whiff of your apple pie on Sundays.
My voice caught, and I had to blink back tears before continuing. Charles reached over and rested a hand on my forearm, silently encouraging me. I cleared my throat softly and went on.
Things are hard here, but don't you worry. Your love keeps me strong. I've got my buddy Joe watching my back, and all the boys here look out for each other. I have faith that I'll be back home with you soon. But if for some reason I don't make it, please know that I am with you in spirit always. Raise our child to know that their daddy loved them more than anything in this world. I'm fighting to make sure our little one can grow up safe and free. Give our baby all my love, and keep some for yourself, my darling. I love you with all my heart, Martha. Yours forever, Henry.
By the time I uttered the final lines, my voice had cracked and dissolved into a sob. I set the letter down carefully. Both Charles and I were openly crying, years of pent-up emotion flowing free. Charles let out a trembling sigh and covered his face with one hand.
Thank you.
He whispered, voice broken.
To actually hear his words, to finally hold this, it's like having a piece of him back, just for a moment.
He wiped his eyes and reached across the table to squeeze my hand.
You did the right thing coming here, Joe. Even if it took a lifetime, you kept your promise in the end. Mum would have been so grateful. And I'm so grateful.
In that moment, the weight of decades lifted off my shoulders. I felt light, truly light, as if Henry himself had placed a hand on my back in forgiveness. The three of us, Henry, Charles, and I, finally had the closure we'd been denied so long ago. We spent the rest of the afternoon at that table, sharing memories. I told Charles stories of the mischief Henry and I got up to as young soldiers, and he told me about the life Henry's sacrifice had allowed him to have, a life of family and love, everything that Henry might have dreamed for his child. We laughed through tears, two old men who had just met, yet felt like family. Eventually, evening came, and it was time for me to leave. At the door, Charles embraced me again, longer and tighter this time.
You'll always have a family here, Joe.
He murmured. I was too choked up to speak, but I managed to smile and pat his shoulder. With a final grateful nod, I turned and walked to the car where my grandson was waiting. As we drove away down the country road, the sky was a breathtaking canvas of orange, pink, and purple. Dusk was settling over the Kansas fields. I gazed out the window at the endless rows of golden crops and felt a profound peace washing over me, the first true peace I'd felt in a lifetime. The promise had been kept at last. Henry's voice, which had haunted my dreams for so many years, was finally at rest. And in the quiet of my heart, I whispered a thank you to Henry, to Martha, to Charles, for giving me the chance to set things right. I closed my eyes for a moment as the fields rolled by, and I pictured two young soldiers in uniform laughing under a bright summer sun, their whole lives ahead of them. A tear slid down my cheek, but it was not a tear of regret. It was relief and gratitude and bittersweet joy for the friend I had lost and finally found again in the echoes of his letter.